President Trump addresses a joint session of Congress. I'm Adam Byrne, and this is the Square Circle. Hello and welcome to the Square Circle. I'm your host, Adam Byrne. Joining us today are policy analyst Joe Albanese, Gregory Clay of gdclay.com, and political correspondent for McClatchy James Rosen. Good evening.
All right.
President Trump gave his first major speech since his inauguration this week before a joint session of Congress. He generally received high marks for sounding more presidential than in the past, but on the substance of the speech, reactions were mixed. So, Gregory Clay, how did you see it?
Well, first of all, based on Donald Trump and his history, the bar was low in the first place. Come on, man. When you start on the ground, there's only one way to go, unless you're going to submerge yourself. But the thing that I noticed the most was the aftermath of his speech. The Dow went up 321 points. So that tells me Wall Street liked his speech. And also because I'm assuming his attention toward infrastructure spending, corporate tax rate cut, and deregulation. Wall Street, I assume, likes all that. That would explain the 321 increase. I mean, to me, that was as big as the speech itself. And you talk about substance, especially for those of us who watch the Dow every single day. And in terms of viewership, I noticed he had 43 million viewers, which was that number actually to me surprised me. I thought that some people would be turned off, but he had 43 million viewers, which was fewer than what Barack Obama had his first State of the Union address. Because Barack Obama in his first State of the Union address had 52 million. But then he also, I think, was the beneficiary of someone who was a historic figure. But Barack Obama, I think, was more a historic figure than Donald Trump, being the first black president, et cetera, et cetera. And Trump, of course, being the real first, businessman type, becoming president. And I'm sure that we'll get into other aspects of his speech as time goes on.
Okay. James Rosen, style versus the substance. What impressed you?
Well, I mean, look, this was Donald Trump looking presidential. I think it's what people have wanted, especially those who are not his most avid followers, for a long time. He's done this before, and as Gregory said, whether he does this instinctively or strategically or for other reasons, he seems to have a pattern of lowering expectations to almost nothing. And then, as Gregory said, it creates such a low bar that if he just sounds, pretty presidential, everybody is just blown away and amazed. I thought on the substance, he did something that Republicans sometimes get angry at when Democratic presidents do it, which is he promised the moon. I mean, he's promising a massive infrastructure spending program of, I think, is it $1 trillion?
$1
trillion.
Yeah.
He's promising tax cuts, and he's promising immigration reforms, which with the wall are very expensive. I've talked with experts who say that if he does everything he wants to do on immigration, you're talking about many tens of billions of dollars.
$12 billion just for the wall.
Just for the wall, but that leaves out a lot of other things. And so he's promising a lot of things, and if you do the math, and if you look at his budget, for instance, it's hard to add up. The math just doesn't add up. But overall, it was a good speech. I think that I saw a poll where 78%, something like that, 78% of Americans responded either very positively or positively to the speech. And although that sounds exceedingly high, it actually was in the neighborhood and maybe a little bit below President George W. Bush's first speech to joint session of Congress, President Obama's, but it was in the neighborhood. And so that's a good result. I think what President Trump needs to do is he needs to stop tweeting. I mean, I think even I've read some tweets. Even some of his followers, I think, are getting tired of the tweets, especially when they come late at night. He's not a drinker, so he's not. We can't blame it on that. But they seem to come late at night when he's alone. He doesn't have his advisors. I think he needs to either stop tweeting or stop tweeting so often, and I think he needs to curtail some of his wilder statements. Now, having said that, Trump's going to be Trump. I mean, he's made that clear for the last 24 months, 2 years since he started running for president. He's ignored advice to tone things down, and so far he's been successful. But he's starting to run into, now that he's president and he's under so much increased scrutiny, he's starting to run into more problems. So overall, I think it was a good speech. I'd like to see him have a run of 2 or 3 weeks where he sounds like that, every day.
And Trump will be Trump is the point that we've heard. He's given us no evidence prior to this that his speech would be anything other than blood and thunder. Joe Albanese, how surprised are you by that?
Well, I think it's kind of a continuation of a theme that you saw throughout the campaign, where basically the Trump campaign, now presidency, would find itself in some kind of crisis. In the last few weeks, it was the resignation of Michael Flynn. It was a host of other Russia-related stories. During the campaign, remember in October, he had the Access Hollywood tapes come out, and there were many Republicans in Congress calling for him to drop out of the race entirely. That was probably the low moment of his campaign. But several times during the campaign, as it is happening now, he would find some way to reverse those fortunes and either cause the polls to close a little bit or get his voters at least on his side. And in this case, as it was the case in the convention, other situations, all he really had to do to reverse his fortunes was not tweet anything crazy for a little bit and read a speech from a teleprompter without ad-libbing too much. It was definitely a big departure from what we saw in his inauguration, that talk of American carnage. Something that was much more of a positive vision, a uniting vision, criticizing anti-Semitism and hate crimes, pointing out a Gold Star widow in the audience, things that were meant to make him look presidential. And the optics of that, I think, worked very well, as James mentioned with the poll numbers. Then there's, of course, the different question of what the substance of what he said was. And in a lot of ways, he was kind of vague. He talked about a $1 trillion infrastructure plan, not really specific about that. Talked about repeal and replace Obamacare. That's been said for years by many other people. I thought some of the more interesting things that he mentioned, though, regarding things like immigration, where he left the door open to changing it from a family-based system to a more skill-based system, probably something that got the business community very excited.
Right.
And endorsing Paul Ryan's border adjustment tax. Right. It's kind of a mixture of things that aren't, some of which are conservative, some of which aren't quite conservative, but it was very on brand, and it was kind of a version of Trump where if he had been campaigning like this the whole time, if he had been acting like this throughout his presidency, sure, he'd be rough around the edges, but he would be coming from a much different place than he is now. And he didn't really get to enjoy that glow for very long. We saw that new Russia stories have come out regarding Jeff Sessions this time, and those still have to be borne out, but the optics of that are very bad, and I can't imagine that Trump will be happy about that.
Yeah, and so I'm sure we'll pick up on some of those points. Gregory Clay, you mentioned the viewership numbers, the ratings.
Right.
This is a TV president. That's how he's become famous.
Right.
How much do you think that will have bothered him, that he didn't get the same viewers as, say, President Obama?
Well, but as I said before, I think President Obama, in terms of history, was a bigger deal, because the first black president, I'm sure so many people wanted to see, well, God, first black president, how is this cat going to do? Prime time, the bright lights, Capitol Hill, joint session, come on, black cat in front of the whole country and the world, as I said, 2009, his first State of the Union address garnered 52 million. Donald Trump garnered 43 million Tuesday night, and Trump's total was still higher than George W. Bush back in 2001. But my basic point is that you're comparing Donald Trump with President Obama. You're dealing with two totally different sets of circumstances. And also with Donald Trump, Albanese was talking about, in the glow of delivering a praiseworthy speech by, people on both sides of the aisle. The word is that Trump and his people purposely did not want to introduce any new policy, especially on Wednesday and today. Well, I shouldn't say today, but also on Thursday. Why? Because they wanted to bask in the afterglow of that quote-unquote praiseworthy speech. Don't disrupt the train while the train, the locomotive is running well. Just bask in that afterglow, and that was intentional until the Washington Post broke that story, late Wednesday afternoon that Albanese referenced a few minutes ago, and that of course blew that whole afterglow thing up. And so now Jeff Sessions called a news conference on Thursday at 4 p.m. and announced to the world that he will recuse himself from all things Russian investigations, etc. But that story is not going to go away. Anything with the Trump administration and Russia, I'm sure will be here for days, afterglow or no afterglow.
It does seem like it, and
weeks, months,
and it seems like the Trump administration can't get away from this story. How upset do you think the White House will be by the Jeff Sessions revelations, given the positive ratings of the speech?
Well, I mean, this is a story that that they can't completely control. There's too many moving pieces. There's too many different parts. There's too many elements. Everybody right now is focused on the ambassador. Okay, and Claire McCaskill, criticized Attorney General Sessions bitterly for having met with the ambassador. Said she never had. Turns out she had. The difference was that she met with him
about 4 years
about
ago.
4 years ago, and Sessions met with him, 4 months, much more recently. But I think that it's not just about Sessions. It's about Trump campaign aides, Trump surrogates, Trump allies, meeting not only with the Russian ambassador, but from what I understand, meeting with other Russian nationals who they may not have known were Russian intelligence agents. I think meeting with the ambassador, you can defend that. Maybe it's controversial, but he's the ambassador, okay? But if you meet with Russians, and especially if you talk policy before you're in the White House, and then if it turns out that you didn't know that they were working for what used to be called the KGB, that they were intelligence agents, and you got duped, and you shared information with them and so forth, that is at a much higher level than this whole debate, to me, over Sessions. And that's why I think there's so many pieces to this and so many unanswered questions that I don't see this story going away for weeks or for months. I don't want to use the W word and say it reminds me of Watergate, but in some ways it reminds me of Watergate, just because there's so many people involved. It's not everybody's focused now on Sessions, but we don't know how many Trump surrogates, Trump aides, people tied to Trump in one way or another met with Russians, and we don't know how many Russians they met with, but we could be talking about dozens of people on both sides. We don't know how many of the Russians were intelligence agencies. We don't know what the Russians know. So this story is going to be around.
Yeah, it will be an evolving one. I think the voices from Capitol Hill seem to suggest that Sessions is maybe having a problem with what he said in his confirmation hearing rather than the meeting itself. So I'm sure that's something we'll pick up on. But Joe Albanese, you mentioned the moments where President Trump pointed to the Gold Star widow, the wife of Navy SEAL Chief Owens, who of course was killed in Yemen only around 2 weeks ago in a raid on an Al-Qaeda compound there. Yeah. How did you see that moment?
Well, frankly, I think that having having widows of military families, of military husbands or wives, having them displayed in a political setting tends to upset the other side almost all the time. In this case, it was, of course, people saying Trump, was a draft dodger, or Trump, doesn't understand the military, or Trump is just trying to take the blame from the failed raid off himself and put it on the military. People kind of took that from his phrasing, the way that he phrased it. At the same time, that doesn't go too well with his history of attacking Gold Star families who were at the Democratic National Committee. At the same time, though, every time President Obama would have a photo op, the conservatives would lose their mind as well, say that he's trying to posture. I think that we generally, as a country, need to decide whether or not this thing is okay for everyone, instead of using sort of the idea of it as a political pawn. I didn't think it was a huge deal. I see why some people disagree, but frankly, I think that most American voters saw it as a presidential moment, and I think that unless you're inclined already to criticize President Trump, then you're willing to see that as a positive thing.
Yeah, one prominent political commentator described it as the moment that he became president.
Yeah, Van Jones of CNN.
Yeah.
Van Jones said that.
But the investigations are still underway into exactly what happened with that raid in Yemen. So was it too soon, Gregory Clay?
No, but I don't think so. But the thing about wasn't a huge deal. But I want to say this before I forget. It was a huge deal for Dan Grillo. Dan Grillo, remember, was a top volunteer for the Hillary Clinton campaign. And he got fired because of Donald Trump pointing out the widow of the Navy SEAL. Why? Because social media. The dude goes on social media and types that the widow should not have been applauding. She looks like an idiot. As supporting for Donald Trump.
And this is I believe, is he a former Clinton?
Yeah. He was a top volunteer for the Hillary Clinton campaign. Dan Grillo, Grillo, and of course he's now working for a securities firm. And earlier today, the firm promptly fired him. And that of course helps Donald Trump. Because it makes the Democrats look bad. To call a widow an idiot, quote unquote idiot, on social media. What do you like Donald Trump?
It's almost as bad as what Trump called the Gold Star widow.
Mr. Khan.
Right. Almost as bad as that.
Yeah. The arguments that I've seen have been that a lot of media types like Van Jones were impressed by the moment, but a lot of veterans have said it was exploitative, especially just 2 weeks after the incident. How do you see it?
Well, look, politics is all about symbolism. It always has been in our country, going back to the founders. And so, like Joe said, I don't think it's as big of a deal as people are making it, and I didn't have as much trouble with it. I think you need to look at a little bit of the context here, which is where President Trump, just a few days earlier, if I believe, very recently, had blamed the Pentagon for the alleged failures of the Yemen raid, and he'd caught some flack over that. And so he was under political pressure to put a more positive spin, if you will, a more positive image, a gloss on that raid. And so, you get a focus on a hero. And so politically, that makes sense to me. This is how any president in that position, or a lot of presidents in that position, it's kind of the response that their advisors would have advised them to do. The problem is that Trump gets himself into these predicaments, like his comments about the Pentagon. It was the Pentagon's fault. It was actually a plan that was developed. The Yemen raid was actually developed pretty much under President Obama. And one of the outstanding questions, to me at least, is: did President Obama not execute the raid or the mission because he didn't think it was sound enough, or was he just running out of time? That's an interesting question. But this was pretty standard politics. I do think that. I'm going to get a little tired if every address to joint session of Congress, State of the Union, and so forth, we start seeing these heroic, the parents of slain heroes in wars. I'm just going to get a little tired of it. I think it's going to grow old. But I understand the use of symbolism.
So we've been talking about his style delivering the speech versus the substance. It seems that some people are concerned about the new department within Homeland Security they're calling Voice, right, which is going to document crimes committed by immigrants on Americans. Mm-hmm. How do you see that?
I mean, having a body that focuses on that, I'm for it. I mean, if it turns out to not be so much of a necessary thing, we find out that the stats on that are much lower than was expected, then we can make a decision later on. But as of right now, there's no government body focusing on that group of people. In the context of Trump's past rhetoric, people might be afraid that it's trying to hate monger against immigrants. Frankly, I think that having professionals, civil servants in that area, it will be a departure from what Trump has said and hopefully do the job in a more professional way.
And they may find out. They may find out very quickly. They may find out that the amount of crime by immigrants or illegal immigrants or whatever it is they're going to focus on is surprisingly low. And then you wonder if they'll cover that up or
we'll get the facts.
We'll get the facts.
Okay. Well, now it's time to take some questions from our viewers, mostly on the speech, but the first one comes from Dwight Hunt, who says, how much of the blame does Trump share for the Navy SEAL's death? Now, I know you were speaking a little bit about that. Is it President Obama's fault who planned the raid? President Trump's fault for okaying it? Gregory Clay.
I'll defer to Rosen.
Former Pentagon.
Yeah, since he covered the Pentagon, back in the good old days.
But the president is the commander-in-chief, and as President Truman famously said, the buck stops here. And
right.
I need to know why President Obama didn't do that raid. I mean, that's before I cast final judgment.
Okay, and do you agree?
I mean, there's so much we don't know about the decision-making process going into it, even if there are some leaks. Ultimately, that is irrelevant because the president should come out and say, this is something that I take responsibility for, and I'm going to try to make sure that doesn't happen again in the future. And I don't know about Monday morning quarterbacking his calls when we don't have full information. But generally, that's how presidents do conduct themselves.
And it sounds that the Pentagon at the moment is trying to get to a place where they can carry out these kinds of raids with less oversight from the White House, when supposedly President Obama was much more focused on the details of these raids. Do you think that's appropriate?
You know, let's be honest. These raids are inherently risky. I mean, the famous raid to kill bin Laden was successful, but a helicopter crashed.
As it did in Yemen.
As it did in Yemen, and there were so many things that had to go right for that bin Laden raid to be successful. Any one or two of which, if they hadn't gone right, that raid would have failed. And so these raids are. Let's not be naive. Let's not pretend that these raids are easy and that they can be executed like. I don't know, like what? Like going to work every day. They're very risky. They're very complicated, and the chances of failure are high. I don't like the people who are criticizing the raid myself, and I just wish they'd quiet down a little bit.
Sometimes you win, sometimes you lose.
Right.
Okay. Well, let's take our next question. It comes from Linda Gibbs, who asks, most of the Democrats bolted out of the room when the speech was over. Was this disrespectful, Joe Albanese?
At the end of the speech, I wasn't aware of that. I mean, I think that, one disrespectful moment that people pointed out was when President Trump talked about draining the swamp and people were audibly laughing or making sarcastic noises. This is something there's precedent in the past, unfortunately, doesn't make it right. We had Representative Joe Wilson saying, you lied to President Obama. We had President Bush get booed for suggesting that we reform Social Security. These are things that are unfortunate because the president does have the platform there, and there should be respect and deference in that. That's an institution and a norm that still matters. People talk about how President Trump has destroyed so many, but we should preserve what ones we do have that show some respect for the office, whether you disagree with the president or not. So even though there have been precedents for this, it's unfortunate, and this is just another unfortunate example in a long list of those.
Well, one of those respectful traditions is lining up in the aisle or waiting for a long time to get a seat on the aisle to shake the president's hands. Some Democrats making a point of not doing that this time around.
That's disrespectful. You know, I mean, that's very disrespectful. I mean, not so much. It shouldn't be about the person. It should be about the office. You know, it should be about the presidency.
And look, we're allowed to protest. Members of Congress are allowed to protest. I don't have a problem with that. The truth is that in the social media age, we are moving a little bit more toward the British style of politics. The Prime Minister gets up in front of the Parliament and gets jeered loudly and booed and hands waving and so forth. We're nowhere near that. So, I mean, to me, this is a little bit overwrought.
Yeah, but this is the United States. I mean, I thought the whole idea was to get away from Britain. To get away from the old country, you know, see what I'm saying? Get away from the old country.
Well,
get away from the OC.
Well, that's certainly where I will wrap that particular part of the conversation up, because now is time for our regular segment, which is the most underreported story of the week. And who would like to start us?
I'll get started, I guess. Some international news. It's no secret to anyone that the country of Venezuela has been suffering for years. There's a story on CNN this week about how they have about $10 billion in cash reserves, which, to put that in perspective, they have about, for the end of the year, $7 billion in debt that they have to repay. It went down from $30 billion in 2011. 2015 was $20 billion, and now it's halved in about 2 years. And because of low oil prices, because of corruption, because of rising prices, the country is just going in a bad direction. And it shows that the current regime, the current socialist economy is just causing more suffering for its people.
Okay, Gregory Clay, what story have you got for us this week?
I will cite a story in the Daily Mail, which of course is based in the old country, the OC in London. And the Daily Mail is reporting that Valerie Jarrett, one of President Obama's chief advisors, has moved into his new mansion in the Colorado section of Northwest Washington. And supposedly she has moved into his mansion with him and Michelle because she's going to spearhead the quote-unquote the shadow government that President Obama supposedly is running simultaneously with and against Donald Trump. And supposedly she's going to be the one leading the charge in regards to make sure the protesters are out, make sure the leaks are out, especially from the Justice Department, to hurt Donald Trump as much as possible.
Okay, and James Rosen.
I think that, to say this briefly, there's a number of states that are fighting the Treasury Department and the IRS over bonds, billions of dollars in bonds that have gone unclaimed, and the federal government wants to keep them. The states want them to go to the last known place holder based on their last known place of residence.
Interesting. Well, that is all for this week. My name's Adam Byrne. Thank you for watching The Square Circle. We'll see you next week.
If you have a passion for helping people, want to launch a new charity, or need help, you have a passion for helping people, we have a passion for helping you. Visit voluntarysolutionsdc.com 844-739-5488.